Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Okay, so I'm continuing the Dare service sermons, and I'm looking at James 5. And the kind of verses that I'm homing into are verse 7 and 8. So I'm just going to read them quickly to you. And it says, "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near." In lots of versions of the Bible, kind of the ESV, it says in verse 8, "You too be patient and establish your heart, because the Lord's coming is near." Now, when I read that in preparation, the thing that kind of I homed in on all of a sudden was the Lord's coming. Okay? And I kind of looked and I felt, and there's a lot of speculation that whether we're in these end times. And the signs of the end times, according to the Bible, are the mark of the beast, to be able to trade in Revelation 13. In 2 Timothy 3, it says that there will be perilous times and that people will be just lovers of pleasure. And in Revelation 11, it says that people will destroy the earth. And in Matthew 24, it says that there will be false Christs and prophets. There will be famine. There will be earthquakes. There will be persecution of those that believe in Christ. As we'll be living in a sinful society. There will be wars, and yet the gospel will be preached throughout the world. So already we can see that perhaps when this speculation arises, that are we in these end times, we can see why, because we can look around at our world at the moment, the things that happened in Paris the other day, and we can think, hang on, maybe like James where he says the Lord's coming is near, the Lord's coming is near. When James was speaking, there was a belief at that time that he believed that the Lord will come again in 70 years from when he wrote that word. And so I'm just going to look quickly at Luke 12 about what is said about the second coming, about how it would be. And in Luke 12, verse 35, it says, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like men waiting for their master return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him." And then just skipping down to verse 40, it says, "You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour you do not expect." And the key that I kind of got from that, and it's very obvious, okay, my sermon this morning is quite obvious, I'll be honest with you, but the key I got from that is we do not know when the Lord will return. We can hazard a guess, like James, I think it's going to be in 70 years. But actually, the truth is, we don't know. And whenever I read about the Lord's coming, I'll be honest, I have a sense of urgency. I get a sense of slight panic of all the things I haven't done for God. And what happens if he came and I wasn't ready? And so when I first read this, and I thought, how am I going to preach a sermon about being patient, about establishing your hearts, about the Lord's coming? And I thought the best thing to do is to be daring. For me, myself, to go out, be daring, and then tell you about it. So I'm going to go over for you, and I hope this isn't tedious or boring, but I'm going to recap some of my actions this week. This is what Monday night looked like. I get in from work, I go to Tesco's, and I thought to myself, this is my perfect opportunity in which to be daring, in which to think, the Lord's coming is near, I will respond to this. So I get in my car and I drive to Tesco's, and as I'm going, I'm like, Lord, I'm going to prophesy in Tesco's. I'm going to heal in Tesco's. Like, come on, bring it on. I want to make Christians in Tesco's. And then I can come to church on Sunday and I can go, look at the fruit. The Lord's coming is near. What are you doing about it? That honestly was my plan. So in the car I take Ralph with me because I thought he's a good conversation starter. I don't shamelessly use my baby for this act. Okay? Get in the car and I drive to Tesco's. And on the way I'm praying, my holy prayers. And I put on some worship music to try and again create this holy atmosphere. And I get in and I go to Tesco. Now before, on the way to Tesco's, I have a phone call from my parents. This happens a lot during my day. I do what I always do and I ignore it. And I continue anyway. When I get to Tesco's, I see it's been recorded a few times, and so I pick up the phone to Mum in the car park, and we have a conversation, and I hear some troubling news. And I think, okay, I need to store that. I need to pray about that, but I'll come back to that in a bit. Anyway, I go into Tesco's, put Ralph into the trolley, and off I go, set off on my mission because the Lord's coming is near. As I go around the aisles, I also, let's be honest, I have to do my shop. As a family, we've got to eat. So I then put various things in the basket. And then, kind of like halfway through the shop, I see Katie King. And I think, great, let's have a chat. But also, to be honest, it was great timing to meet Katie, because my mum had phoned with this troubling information. If I was going to talk to anyone about it, it probably would have been Katie. So I kind of offload a bit onto her. And as Katie always does, she gives me wise wisdom back. And then I go on my way. And now I look at the time and I think, gosh, it is nearly Ralph's bedtime. I need to hurry up. Otherwise, he's going to explode in abundance of tears. And it's going to be embarrassing in Tesco's. So off I go with my trolley and I just clamber things into it, go through the checkout, I've forgotten the bags. Don't you hate that? You get to the till and you think, oh. So I'm like, I'm really sorry. Can I just run to the car, get the bags? So I have to do that, cause a bit of a queue, a bit humiliating. Get loaded the shopping up, get in the car, think, phew, I've got 10 minutes before Ralph's bedtime, drive off home. Get home. I leave the shopping in the car because it's nearly Ralph's bedtime. He's got to get into bed. That at the moment is a priority on my mind. I'm also thinking about this troubling situation, the advice that Katie's given me. And so I get Ralph into sleep. Johnny, whilst all this happening, he's unloading the car. Wonderful. Then, whilst getting Ralph off to sleep, it occurred to me, what was I meant to be doing in Tesco's? Oh, the Lord's coming is near. I was meant to be. I was going to prophesy that night. I was going to heal that night. I was going to tell people the gospel that night. And do you know what happened? Life happened. Life happened. You know, something happened to my family and I had to respond to that. My baby had to get into bed and I had to respond to that. And this poses a massive question for me. That how do we live life and Christ? You know, how do we get through? And I don't know if you're the same with me, but sometimes my day is purely survival. You know, I get to the end and I tuck myself up and I think, phew, I have survived. Tick. Let alone go next door and tell my neighbour about Jesus. And that the Lord's coming is near. Yet what am I doing about it? And yet I'm desperately just trying to survive. You know, and I look back at James, and actually these verses give me some real comfort. And I'm just going to go back to James 7. It says, "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for his land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains." You know, often in the Bible, when we hear something about farming, it's often connected with kind of salvation and cultivating Christians. So, for example, the parable of the sower in the Gospels, and also kind of connected with that, Jesus saying, you know, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And here, I think that perhaps this again is a symbol for that. That the farmer has kind of yielded his crop, and then he's waiting for the rains to come. And I want to pick out on two things. That he is patient when he waits for the valuable crop to yield. That actually the farmer just does his job. He plants the crops and then he waits. He waits for that fruit to come. He does his job and then he waits. And sometimes in our life, you know, I think this is what James is trying to get at with this symbol, is that we are like this farmer, that we're just to be who God has given us to be. You know, this farmer is a farmer, and this is really incorrect English, but it's the only way I kind of can think of saying it. He bees a farmer. You know, that's all he does. And then he waits for the rains and the sun, which is something out of his control. And you know, James, the book of James, isn't about these huge, grand Christian gestures. It isn't about these miraculous, spontaneous happenings. And yes, they do happen in the Bible, and yes, I think they'll happen in our lives. But actually, James is about just being a Christian in the small things. On the day-to-day, it's like the farmer on the day-to-day just plants his crops. That's what he does his job. And in the same way, we just be Christians in what we do. You know, it remains, to illustrate this point further, it links me back to Noah. You know, last sermon I preached about Noah and about him building the ark as this analogy for us building God's kingdom in our lives. And you know, there's a long period of time where Noah must have simply banged in nails or sanded wood or measured wood or carved wood. And that must have been quite a monotonous process for such a big boat, that sometimes he probably just spent weeks sanding and weeks hammering and weeks measuring. And yet it links to what James is talking about, that actually in the monotony of life, in the routine of life, in the day by day, what are we to do? We are to be people of integrity that look in a mirror and don't forget what we look like. We're to be people that can tame our tongues and have control of it and stop ourselves from saying rude remarks or getting involved in gossip. It's those people that in those small moments decide to be different and decide to leave things of the world and to step aside. You know, Michael Smith from Delirious said this line, and it kind of summarized what I'm trying to say right now. He says, it's not about the big things. You know, in a concert, they were a big Christian band, and he said it's not all about the big things. It's about the small things done with a big heart. And you know, I think day by day, it's about living as James commands us to, with integrity, with honesty, with truth, with a tongue that doesn't hurt, but a tongue that encourages. And in these small things, we lead to a life of Christ. It's about being a Christian and not doing big things. You know, this also reminds me of a book, the story of Esther. Okay? Before I move on, I just want to clarify one thing. It will come actually, sorry. I was going to take a steer, but actually I won't. I'll come back to that. This reminds me of the story of Esther. I love this book, and for those of you that don't know it, I'll just summarize it quickly for you. This is going to be a very basic summary, so I'm sorry, theologians. I don't mean to offend, but this is my basic understanding. There is a king, and there is a queen, okay? And the queen, at the beginning of Esther, disobeys the king. The king gets mad. And so he therefore, one of his advisors, who I believe is called Hammon, says to him, why don't you kind of look through the virgins of the land, get them together and pick a new queen? So the king goes, wonderful idea, let's do that. Now, through the virgins that they pick, Esther is one of them. And Esther is a Jew. And she knows a chap called Mordecai, who is also a Jew, who sits himself at the king's gate for various reasons that we'll find in a minute. At that point, we come into the story. And I'm going to read some verses to you about Mordecai and one of the king's people that gives him, who goes to see him. And it says in chapter 4, verse 7, Mordecai told him everything that happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told them to urge her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to go to Mordecai. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he or she was to be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do you not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape? For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to the royal position for such a time as this?" And so at this moment in time, Esther is kind of in the king's courts. Mordecai is asked her to plead, for her to go and plead to the king to not destroy the Jewish people. Now, at this same time in chapter 6, this happens. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles and the record of his reign to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway and who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of that palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse throughout the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Get at once," the king demanded. Haman, "get the robe and the horse, and do just exactly what you've said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Now, I love this story, and I'll just quickly reiterate what happens. On one place, we've got Esther, okay? Jewish, beautiful. She's been in the king's courts, and she's been there for 6 months through this kind of beautifying process to get ready to see the king. Now, during that process, Mordecai appeals to her, "Please go and see the king and get him to save the Jewish people, including yourself." And he says, you could have been there for such a time as this. Esther says back to him, "That's really tricky, because the only way you can enter and see the king is for him to put out his gold scepter. If he doesn't do that, then you're dead." That's happening in this one camp. The other camp here is the king has gone to sleep. He can't sleep. So he wakes up, he looks at a book, the book of Chronicles, and he finds out that once upon a time Mordecai had done something right. Okay? And he was like, what's been rewarded for this man? What reward has he got? And Haman's, he finds out nothing's been done. So he then calls Haman and says, "What do you think should happen to somebody who's done a good deed?" Haman thinks that he's talking about him, so creates this big, wonderful, elaborate plan of the reward. And actually, then the man that Haman is about to put on the gallows, the man that he's about to kill because he's a Jew, the king then says, give him that honor that you've just discussed, that you've just said about. So these two things are happening at this time. Now, what I think these two things portray in light of James 5 is that first and foremost, God does what God does, and we don't necessarily know. Esther and Mordecai had no idea the king was going to get woken up in the night, that actually Mordecai, expecting to go to the gallows, was actually going to be pranced around on the city on a horse and praised. God moves. God does what he does. He has a huge plan that we actually don't know about. His second coming is coming, but we don't know when. And therefore, when I go to Tesco's and on the way I say to God, "God, you've got an hour and a half basically to turn up in Tesco's Whitfield and do something," yeah? How ridiculous does that look? That's not my job to say. My job's to be the farmer. My job's to farm. You know, the farmer had no control about when the sun and the rains came. That's God's control. We have no kind of say in that. Our job is to do what James has said, is to be people of integrity, to be people of truth, to people who tame our tongues, people that look in the mirror and don't, walk away without recognizing themselves instantly. Our job is, as James says in chapter 5, verse 8, to establish our heart. And establish literally means to set up on a continual basis. And so we are to set up our hearts on a continual basis. Our hearts are to reflect the heart of Jesus Christ on a continual basis. Our hearts are to be hearts that we cultivate like a farmer on a continual basis. That's our role. And when the rain comes and when the sun comes, we don't know. That's out of our control. But what I do know as well from Esther is my second point, is that there will become a time for each individual where we cultivate our hearts, we establish our hearts, we, like Noah, continue sanding our lives, sanding those bits of sin that we're to make war on, as Joe said last week, to hammer those nails, in things that we shouldn't be saying anymore. Things that we're meant to be doing this day and day, because at one point God will say to us, right, and now you're to do this for such a time as this. Now I want you to move for such a time as this. Now there is a harvest and you go out and reap for it's such a time as this. But it is not our job to govern when God's going to come. It's not our job to go and to govern when the rain and the sun's going to come. It's not our job to go like to Esther. If she had walked in unprepared to that king, she would have been dead. She had to wait. And that is the word that is reiterated and repeated in James 5, verse 7 and 8. We are to be patient. We are to do as James says, to establish our hearts, continually molding them, being Christ-like, waiting for the time where Christ says, and now this is what I have built you for. This is what I've created you for such a time as this. To link it back to Noah, I love that story so much. God didn't tell Noah when the rains would come. He just told Noah to build the ark and what it should look like. In the same way, we're to build God's kingdom. And James, the whole book of James tells us exactly what his kingdom is to look like. So that when the rains come and the floods come, we're ready. We are prepared. And sometimes I get tired, I'll be honest, of hearing doom messages. I remember when Johnny and I went on holiday when I was pregnant, it was kind of like we thought this is our kind of last holiday without children. And Johnny turns around and he says, whilst we're on holiday, let's read James together. And do you know what I shouldn't possibly tell you this whilst up here, but I'm going to. My response to Johnny was, I don't want to read James, because it just makes me feel bad of all the things I'm not doing. That was my honest response. Because sometimes I read James and it feels like a chore list for me of all the things I'm just not, and all the things I'm meant to be focused on. But the Lord's coming is near. And our hearts need to reflect the heart of James that he's talking about. And so how to do that without it feeling like a chore is really simple. And it talks, as I read in Luke 12, it talked about getting our hearts being ready, being waiting for the Lord's return, like masters of people of a house waiting for their master's return from a wedding banquet. And I think about planning my wedding, and Matt and Jodie got married last week. Congratulations. Yeah, and I loved planning my wedding. I did. I loved it because I loved the man I was marrying. And in the same way, we should love preparing for the wedding. As the church in the Bible is often described as the bride of Christ. We should love getting our hearts ready to be united with Jesus Christ. Because surely we're in love with Jesus. And if we're not interested, and it said a lot about my heart at that time when I was in Portugal, if I wasn't interested in getting ready for Jesus coming again? What does that say about my relationship with him? And that's a bit of a hard truth, but it's true. You know, and it was a lot easier planning my wedding with Johnny. In fact, we delighted in it. There's times when we were creased up in laughter about some of our crazy and insane ideas, one of which Johnny actually wanted at one point a bat to fly in to deliver the wedding rings. I don't know how that wedding happened, but you know, it was a joy planning that wedding with Johnny. And it should be a joy preparing to be in heaven with Jesus. It should be a joy taming our tongue. It should be a joy making war on those areas of sin in our lives. It should be a joy being patient and waiting for him. And if it's not, then I'll just want to remind you of a little story in Luke 10. And it's of Mary and Martha. It's only a few verses, and it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Here we've got Martha who's focused on the chores. Here we've got Martha kind of running around, busy. She's doing everything. And then we've got Mary who's just being with Jesus. And this is kind of my final challenge that, you know, in James, as I've read, the Lord is coming. We need to establish our hearts. But if you feel like Martha, that involves you running around doing chore for Jesus Christ to try and make you holy, then I would question, are you being with Jesus? And if so, go home, strip away all the distractions, and just sit at his feet to establish your heart. Just sit at the feet of Jesus. And I think what that looks like is just worshipping. It's just worshipping Jesus for who he is. Because there's this old song, and I know I've quoted it before in a sermon, that says, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of the world grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and his grace. You know, when we look at Jesus Christ full in the face, everything else suddenly has very little significance to it. And so the Lord's coming is near. We are to establish our hearts. It is not for us to govern our own agendas, but it is up for us to live as James has commanded us to, and to wait patiently for our moments where God says, now this is where you move for such a time as this. God has a plan. We are to interact with it. The only way we can do that is by being with him.